Well, welcome back to the podcast, the Connect Church podcast, Distilling Life. And today we are on episode 3, and the series is called I'm Fine, But Not Really. And so today we have John. Great to have you on board with us.
Thank you.
Yep. And Innes as well.
Hello.
And myself, Zach. And so we are just going to be discussing the subjects of when chaos, messiness, hecticness, life is coming in, and then just how we process that and how we journey with that. So part of the point of these podcasts is to give folks a chance to kind of be a part of a conversation, and they can take that home or, just chat about it or process it themselves. And so I kind of broke it down into kind of 3 categories: chaos, mayhem, stuff that we've been through, and kind of maybe a bit of our stories and where we're coming from. And then how do we handle that? And, sometimes we handle things well, but actually sometimes we don't handle things very well, and kind of maybe what we've learned from that. And that's the last part, which is the takeaways. What are some things that kind of stood out with us? And so I'll just kind of paint the scene a little bit in the lens of, I remember I was at school at uni, and it was I think it was a Friday morning, and it was like 8 a.m., get a phone call from my mom. And it was kind of one of those calls that you don't want to get, but you knew you were getting. And it was my grandfather had passed away. And he was the first one to pass away out of everyone I knew, really. So very first kind of like experience of death and just the heaviness of that. And I remember being in my dorm room and just, wow, that just hits like a wave. And it's like, this is gonna be a hard day. And my roommate came in and afterwards and was like, hey, what's going on? And I kind of shared. And there was this moment where it was either me or him, but like just kind of like the humor comes out, and it's like, hey, you realize today you're going to be on campus, and people are going to say, hey, how's your day going? And you're like, oh, I'm good, I'm great. But really deep down, you're not. I was working through that. And so the reality is, like, I think we've all journeyed through some degrees of pain, chaos, hurt, difficulties, and just wanted to know if we want to share kind of a bit of our journeys and what that looks like.
I think one of the biggest things for me is to go, and it's honestly the hardest, is to go, who can I talk to about it? Because, you're going to walk around all day and people going, how are you doing? You're like, oh, I'm fine. Because, well, that's not the conversation you want to have with absolutely everybody. And sometimes it's visible you're not doing well, and you kind of say it and you get the token, oh, I'm sorry, but it doesn't actually help. It's that, but going, who actually do you know that you can talk to? Who can help you unpack that stuff? If you're stuck by yourself trying to deal with everything, that's when we get overloaded. And finding the right people, knowing who you can trust, even having language to learn how to talk about some of these things, that's what's actually really difficult. In my life, about 3 years ago, my mom died, and at a similar time, was having some financial problems that put some strain on my marriage, and then there were some other work-related sort of tensions that came up, and it just felt like everything was happening at once. And my strategy for dealing with it was ignore it all, put my head down, just keep plowing through, and hopefully I'll get to a spot where everything feels a little clearer and I can start dealing with it. And I'm going to say that was the worst strategy. It didn't work. And
Why didn't it work?
Why didn't it work? Because the more you ignore all the problems, the less they go away, right? And stuff starts building. And so in his letter to the Galatians, Paul talks about how we're supposed to bear one another's burdens. So when stuff comes along that's really hard, really heavy, we need people to help carry that weight. But about 2 sentences later, he says each person should carry their own load. And it's a bit of a strange thing, but I think the point is we all have stuff that we just have to do, and that's our stuff. But the heavy stuff, the really big things that come up in our life, that's what we need help with. But what we tend to do, or at least I tend to do, and I think a lot of people do this as well, is we don't know how to talk about the hard stuff. We don't know how to ask for help for the big stuff. And we end up can't figure out what to do with that, but we start dropping all the regular everyday stuff. And that's what people come around and try to help us with. Mm-hmm. And that's nice. And I'm not saying it's not nice when somebody comes and says, hey, anybody wants to come help me clean my house? I'm happy for that, right? But it doesn't help me deal with what actually I need the help with.
And I think with the big things, if it's really big, that's when you actually need somebody who's qualified to help. It used to be that was like, especially growing up in the church, to go to counselling, that's almost like, that's not something Christians do, because we've been like, we know Jesus, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But actually, Jesus has put us in situations where in private communities, with now larger kingdom communities, networks, and he's provided people who have that, who are qualified, they've done training, or they're just incredibly gifted in that area. Yeah. And sometimes having the outside perspective of, actually, you don't know them.
Absolutely, and they don't know you, and you're not going to be bumping into them at work or
don't have a skin
church.
in the game. They're basically just going, I'm only here to help you make sense.
And to say, how are you getting some help?
Yeah.
When my grandpa passed away, it wasn't until about a year or 2 years afterwards that I then started processing it in a relatively unhealthy way, and just it was breaking down and stuff, like just a mess. Yeah. And death in one sense is hard to work through, but life also has another whole bunch of curveballs. And it's like, if you're just going to bury it, you know, and then pretend nothing's happened, or don't even think about it, part of me is like, why do we do that? And I think partially like the pride factor of I don't want to speak up. Part of it is, and I think you said this last episode in a different context, but you said something like the value of community is kind of having like getting out of your echo chamber. Yeah. And I think sometimes we don't even realize that we're not processing something in a healthy way because we're doing it on our own.
I can remember it was my grandma died. I had a similar thing of, I was probably 15, 16, and totally ill-equipped to deal with, didn't have the language, didn't even understand what was going on in terms of dealing with. And it definitely took a long time for that, even understand how to cry. Didn't know how to do that. And it was a really weird intervention almost by somebody who basically just got my face. And it wasn't in an aggressive way, it was basically just they took a risk and basically the dam just burst. And that was that's not something that happens very often, where it was something, God was doing something that night, and I was trying to run, and they stood in the way, and basically I ran into them. And part of the chaos we feel is because we think we're in control, and when things don't go the way we planned, or we think they should, we think we experience that chaos and that vulnerability, and we don't like that. I read a phrase when I was thinking chaos. I'm sure I've read something about chaos, and I was trying to find it in some books I'd read, and I came across the title book of Surfing the Edge of Chaos, and it was just referred to the book. I haven't read that book, but it was just such a great title, and a great concept of actually how do we engage with chaos. It's not that we want to live in chaos all the time, but actually the opposite is also really bad. That if life is so structured and so controlled, then it's also dead. So there's a harmony we need, where things are alive and things are happening and things are changing, and we're growing and we're learning new things and we're developing and we're engaging with the world around about us, and that's scary and uncontrolled. That's where the excitement is as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes we talk about chaos as talking about life going off the rails, but it can only go off the rails when you've got a clear idea of what the rails are. And the more rigidly we hold to this is what it's supposed to be, the more it throws us when that shifts.
So in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the earth, and tohu abohu, which is the Hebrew of chaos, and God takes chaos and creates order and creates, and you see the beautiful story of creation. And it's funny because it's like, I was just even thinking about this earlier this week, about how like in those moments of just sheer chaos, we tend to be quite safe with who we open our chaos with, you know. And when I look at the church, and the whole premise of the gospel is that we aren't able to do life on our own. We aren't good enough on our own. It's by grace of God. It's by working together. It's in community. And yet chaos gets tossed in our way. And there's this moment where we're like, I won't say anything here. And part of me is like, I think that might be a tension that people have, myself included, with general church, because it's like, some people will say, church is shallow or empty, but that's not really what they're saying. What they're saying is, I can't bring my chaos in a safe environment, and I can't open it up, or I don't know how to handle this. And I wonder what your thoughts are on, in the lens of like, what is the space for the church in general, and bring in my own crap and chaos and all that.
I think my biblical understanding, my theological constructs, and all of that say the church needs to be a place where people are free to bring that. My personal preferences, on the other hand, are potentially the opposite. Who do I feel safe bringing that to? Who's it appropriate to bring that to? And there were a couple of people who I did chat with, and that was great. And, but it doesn't mean I bring it in for everybody. Yeah. The church needs to be a place, and when no one feels safe, there's something wrong with the culture of the church. We have such a nice, pristine, this is what church looks like, it's all neat and packaged, and no one wants to bring their messiness into it. And we need to feel free that things get interrupted. It doesn't all have to look pristine. And when everything looks pristine, I think you end up with what, Jesus described as whitewashed tombs. It all looks nice on the outside, but on the inside it's rotted and festering. And, the more it has to look clean and pretty on the outside, the more horrific stuff often lies underneath.
If we can't do this well within church, so that almost everyone gets to a certain, as deep as they can go, what's the purpose of church?
In many ways, when we talk about community, we think about this warm, fuzzy, marshmallowy type experience. And I think Alan Hirsch and Mike Frost books, one of them, they talk about community versus communitas. And I'm not quite sure where, I can't remember where communitas came from. But with that, it talks about more within almost a shared struggle. Mm-hmm. And the bonds that are built up because you're on, you have a shared experience or a shared struggle, and I think that is part of the challenge that church has. Is I think church wants to have the safe space without the shared struggle. Maybe it's us that we want to get the warm fuzziness and the benefits without the cost. Yeah, and thinking back, and it's interesting just thinking about who are the people I would go to when I hit chaos or I hit disappointments or I struggle or I need advice. And it's really interesting just thinking back that there's a group of people that Caroline and I have in our lives, because most of them are shared. And they're going back to university times. Thinking back to why are those people trusted, why are those people there? But it's because we had shared experiences. Yeah. And we'd messed up together, we'd fallen down, picked each other up, we'd made mistakes, been forgiven, we've fallen out, fallen back in again. But there's just a history there of we kind of get it, we get each other. And that takes a lot of time. I think if church wants to create that space and to be that place that transforms lives, and is a place that people go and they're meeting other people who help them surf the chaos, and that's hard, because then you have to be willing to take the risk, to struggle and to fail and to not be in control.
And you have to give up the time. Yeah. I mean, I think we tend to have very individual lives, and church is often the thing what we come together for. Yeah. With people who we don't see for the rest of the week. Yeah. I've lived in this country for 18 years now, and for the last 12, almost 13, I've been raising children. Yeah. Right? And So my world went from, you know, being a single person who's got lots of time to being a married person who has a little less time to being a dad, and now a dad of 4. And, you know, with a job and sometimes other like volunteer things at church and that, I'm like, my time's been so parceled out that, you know, I realize I don't have tons of friends, and I don't have tons of time for building friendships.
Yeah.
So you sometimes just have the sort of fun, superficial mates who you hang out with. You go for a pint, you go to the cinema, you know, but how often does that get deep? The shared experiences sitting at the pub or at the cinema, you know, that's not where the challenges happen. So
my best friend Ryan, he just recently got married, and we first got in ministry pretty much the same time, and like everything, like, so your 20s are your years of crisis, so everything's a crisis. Like, you're like spiraling down, like, you know, how do I pay rent, how do I cook, how do I sustain life as I know it? And so you go through that stage where you're sharing, you're like, I remember talking with Ryan being like, I don't know how to cook a meal, like I know how to microwave and make a great bowl of cereal, but that's about it. And then him walking through that, and then we'd talk about like ministry struggles and the frustrations and the joys, and then you get kind of to the point where you're like, you grow up a little bit more, and you know how to keep yourself more or less alive and things, and you're not in small crises that you are perceiving as massive, like life change, like life accidents, and so what happens is, I think in one respect you kind of get to the point where, you know, you kind of can coast in life in the lens of life's not always a crisis, and so you don't know how to bring that up. But then, like, I even think about our Connect meals. My heart behind that was that we're sitting around, we're having a meal, we're sharing life, but I think experience-wise, we're struggling at getting much deeper than, hey, how's your week, you know, and oh, this meal that I'm having right now is fantastic, or you know, talking about a certain shallow level. And I think it's the right direction, but it's how do you go deeper? Like, what does it take to do that? And my instinctive response is courage and boldness and vulnerability, which are just like, you know, catchwords that you can say, but in one sense it's like, that's a scary thing, that'd be like, all right, no one else is going deep, so I'm gonna go deep.
I think there's patience involved with it, because you can, now, especially if you're thinking about a monthly meetup, it takes time to build relationship. But I think also you can't manufacture that the drama
or the drama.
And if I think it's only when it happens you see the proof's in the pudding, basically, like from the meal analogy. It's only when things go to pot that you realise whether the foundation's been built in those meal times, and that is time, presence, and just talking about the small things initially, to then have the foundation to then reach out when things are a bit more chaotic.
Just when I was back in Canada, I used to work with a summer camp ministry, and for a number of years I worked with 16 and 17-year-olds in a sort of leadership development program that we'd run. And part of the program we did was we would send all of them on these like 4-day wilderness canoe trips. And you'd get to the evaluation at the end of the summer, like, okay, how's the program gone? And there were always people saying, why do we do the canoe trips? You know, and they're like, inevitably something goes ridiculously wrong on them, and is the, you know, sort of health and safety risk worth doing it? You know, in terms of the input, you know, we're doing training with them the rest of the time. They're not getting trained during that trip. And so there was always this debate. But the thing is, what we found is it's that shared experience that happened during it. This is where they had the challenges that aren't simulated challenges that we engineer for them to grow through. This is where, you know, in one sense it's a bit artificial because we're making them do this trip. But the trips that ran smoothly had way less growth than the trips where something went wrong. Somebody, for some reason, left one of the packs on the bus, And, you know,
Yeah.
all of a sudden they're like, we've got lunches, but no dinners. What do we do? You know, or somebody's,
Go hunting.
you know, somebody flips their canoe and they hadn't waterproofed their sleeping bag correctly. And, you know, but it's how you come together, how you deal with these things, that actually you saw these guys massively grow, and the stuff that was more difficult got way better, longer lasting relationships out of it. And, you know, I recognize camping's not, you know, it's probably, we're probably all good with it. Not everybody's the most outdoorsy camping thing. There are other things that you can do instead of that, but it's sharing life. If you look at how relationships are built, there's, you know, they sort of have this sort of like filter effect, like, and there's so much at the top that's really wide that's actually shallow. And it's superficial stuff. And then you get to the deeper stuff that's kind of personal. But if you try to mine straight down to the intimate relationship stuff, it actually, it's very artificial to have a relationship that only deals with the intimate, without the weight and the support of like all the superficial that helps allow that to happen, which is why it works in a counseling kind of situation, because that's not a real life relationship. It's
Contractual.
It's contractual, and you can do it because that's not a maintained relationship. It's a parceled thing. But when we try to do that in a church kind of environment and going, oh, we want relationships that are deep and do that and skip the top part, we either find people resist it and won't go for it because they're not comfortable, or they end up often being unhealthy because you've got all this intimate knowledge without the context for it.
Yeah, so I think the last part that I just kind of want to bring us into is, like, what are some takeaways that you guys have experienced, you know, and how do you yourself, what are you looking for in someone that you're going to confide in? What are some signs that you should look for?
You know I sometimes have issues trusting that what I tell someone isn't going to get repeated everywhere. For me, it's a big thing to go, are you somebody who's going to go, oh man, you won't believe what I just heard?
Yeah.
You know, and
Twitter.
yeah,
Can you believe this person said this?
yeah. So that's a sometimes a first and big factor. Is this person someone who, you know, understands what details to share and what details that you don't share?
Again, one of the things thinking back, that there's definitely the people that I think about are probably people who are at a similar stage than me, and I think because then again it's that they kind of get it, and I think that's something that we've, just as a family, we've noticed that we seem to be out of sync, just stage of life, with a lot of the church experiences we've been in. Whether it's Caroline and I or the kids, they've just been slightly out of sync, which has meant that although everyone's really nice, there's not a real connection.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's one of the advantages of the church, though, is that it's not a, we need some of that,
Yes.
of people in same similarities of life, but actually one of the cool things is church isn't just a club of people who are in the exact same place doing the same things. It creates something where you get very different perspectives that you actually would naturally miss.
Yeah.
And if we can't get comfortable talking about what we have in common, how are we going to get comfortable talking about the things we don't have in common? And going, wait, you're in a completely different stage of life, but not only can you have an interesting perspective on what I'm going through, is actually you have the ability to listen to God, who has the best perspective.
Yeah.
And I can be open to hear what you have to say in the midst of it.
One of the things I've found as well is, it's, this is going to sound really backwards, so just bear with me, but there's something weighing on you, and you're afraid to share with them because you're like, oh, they're gonna think completely different about me, and they're gonna think I'm the worst person ever. But actually, people, like, you share some pretty heavy stuff, and people actually, they don't think less of you often, you know, from it. Like, it's surprising how that's not really that case. Now, granted, there are some exceptions.
We do admire honesty and vulnerability, and there is something that you can go, wow, that's brave, and I recognize the hurt somebody's going through. I recognize the struggle, and I recognize the desire for help. I've met people, and we've probably all met that one or two people, you know, who just always need.
Yeah.
And going, how, and I think we're afraid of being perceived as that person.
Yeah.
I remember a story of, you know, a meeting where, in a church meeting, and people were invited to confess their sins. And strangely, at the end of the meeting, you generally don't remember anybody's.
Yeah.
Because you just remember the amazing feeling of forgiveness and acceptance that people have. And the story went that there was one person who was just, they kind of confessed, but they were clearly unrepentant in the midst of it. And amazingly, that's the only one people remember. The grace of God covers an awful lot.
And I think the heart behind this is, you know, I think in church, in Connect specifically, we need to have these kind of conversations. We need to have these conversations around the tables while we're having meals. But not everyone's there yet, and that's okay. And that's where, you know, having a meal, having fun, having games, but also intentionally asking yourself, am I willing to take the next step in trust in this pack, if you will? Because actually, if we're going to be on mission even, there's got to be a community that's actually like trustworthy within itself. And I think, you know, it takes time. It takes years, and it takes moments for it to just get wrecked by something really hurtful. And I think that's kind of the balancing act in the lens of, you know,
Yeah. I mean, Jesus said, you know, that how we love one another proves A, that he's who he said he is, and B, that we actually follow him. It's hard to be demonstrating that we really love one another if we're not willing to be real.
So on that note, Ennis, would you mind just wrapping us up?
If I just give you all this chat and just all the points I've maybe attempted to make or I've made, and you know, I just pray that you would make sense of it. We pray that you would create a community within us that isn't just surface level, isn't just going through the motions, but is actually engaged and has some depth to it, has some reality to it. So yeah, Lord, I just pray your blessing on those who are listening, and in Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thanks for listening or watching in on the podcast, and we'll catch you on the next episode. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Joshua. Thanks, guys.